Cool. Mics
All
are
right.
live. Cameras are rolling. Well, not rolling because it's not film anymore.
I am old enough to remember those days, and I have loaded film and cameras.
Do you want to start with this story of that one day when you go from getting kicked out of your job to going into college?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I thought that was pretty cool.
Well, that was a watershed event in my life, and it was indicative for me of, remembering that you can have a big impact on somebody's life. I don't think a lot of people realize that. I think teachers know that. I think teachers eventually, somebody comes back and says, man, you really made a difference in my life. And I know that teachers have told me that students have come back and said that, but I found myself basically sleeping on a guy's sofa. I didn't have a job. I was working part-time at the Army National Guard headquarters where I belonged. I'd gotten a job I'd signed up for the Army Guard and enlisted in the unit. And then I lost my job and I was basically living on a couple $100 a month. I had no money for rent. My car occasionally ran when I had gas money. So life was really, really hard. And I was getting extra work from the Guard. So I went down there one morning to do my usual thing in the office and type up hand receipts for the supply room and all that, which, parenthetically speaking, became a real value later on when I went in the Army. And the sergeant first class I worked for walked in the door, and he'd already seen my bicycle outside, so he knew that my car wasn't running again, and he just stood in the door and looked at me. I looked over to him, and I said, "Morning, Sergeant First Class. How you doing?" And he proceeded to just chew me up one side and down the other. He'd had enough. I was divorced. I was broke, basically bankrupt. And he said, "Get out. I'm tired of watching you waste your life. Get out." And I said, "Oh, I can't afford this." And he said, "Don't come back until you're signed up for college classes." Now, luck sometimes enters into these things. And so I was lucky in that the Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday that he threw me out of the office was right before the start of Summer 1 session at the University of Arizona. So I got on my bike at 1750 East Silver Lake and rode all the way up to Campbell and Grant, and that's a long ride. And I was sweating at the end, and I found all my transcripts and everything because I'd done a lot of community college work, and I had darn near 2 years worth of credits already done, and that's what was frustrating him. And I went to the campus, got there sometime after lunch, and said, "Okay, what do I do?" Just walked up to the lady in the admissions office, and she said, "Whoa, you really are lost." And I said, "I don't know what to do. How do I do?" I think I said something along the lines of, "How do I do this here college thing?" And when she finishes laughing like you did, she said, "Okay, let me take you through this." Now, I'm still in uniform, by the way. I'm still wearing my green fatigues. And she said, "Okay, do this, do this, do that." Pulled out the catalog, said, "All right, we have a 3-week pre-session. And a quick glance at your records tells me you haven't taken a U.S. history class yet." And I said, "Well, I guess that's true." She said, "Okay, you're lucky there's a session. It starts Monday. The classes meet every morning. It's 3 weeks. So you got to meet, I think it was like 4 hours every day. It's hard." I said, "Okay." So she enrolled me in that class, said, "You're a veteran, so you don't have to pay anything up front." I said, good deal for that. Thank you to the state of Arizona for that. And she said, "In the VA office is directly across the mall there at Bear Down Gym." And I said, "Okay," went over there, signed up for my benefits. Had an appointment, I think the next day or the day after, with an advisor. The admissions lady had set me up with that. So I figured I'd go into business school. Why not? I'd heard it was the easiest. And when I was done, there was a poster on the wall behind me as I'm signing up for my GI Bill benefits. Right about the time the guy told me, "Oh, by the way, you don't get your benefits for about 5-6 months from now. It takes that long for the VA to process them." And he wasn't lying. It really did. The VA was horrendous in that respect back then. They're somewhat better now. And I said, "Okay, what do I do?" And he said, "Well, I can fix you up with a work-study job." He called over to the counseling office. He got me an interview for the next day or the day after, I forget which. And as I turned around to walk out, I looked and I saw there was a poster for the ROTC program. I said, "What's the deal with that?" He said, "Hey, they'll pay you $100 a month." Well, that was like twice what I was, that would increase my income by 50%. I said, "Okay, where do I go?" He said, "Basement of Old Main." They're not there anymore. They have their own building, but I went down there and I walked in, saluted Captain James Brennan, who was the only guy there because it was summer break. And I told him what I was doing, and he put a form in front of me, and he said, sign the bottom line there, cadet, and you start getting paid in September. I'm like, okay, sir, I'm in. Signed it. He said, I'll give this to supply sergeant, and you can plan on picking up your uniforms in September. I said, okay, I guess I'm now on a roll. And I think it was the next day. I keep thinking it was the same day. I think it was the next day I got on my bike and I rode back down to the headquarters, and I told my sergeant first class what I had done. And he said, if you hadn't signed up for ROTC, I was going to kick you in the ass again, but good. You can go back to work now. And I got a little bit extra time for you. And it dovetailed nicely with what other people had told me, which was, all right, look, you're at this point, what was I, 25 years old, coming on 20. I think I just turned 26. And it was time to get my life together. I did not have any income. I didn't have any prospects. I had been fired from the job that I had that paid all the money that I needed to pay for my house, and I had to ditch the house, which ended up turning into a debacle. So I got some people in my life, luckily, or had some people in my life who, very luckily, they jumped in and said, all right, go get your act together. And the rest becomes then a career in the Army, and then become a career, and then leads to a career in government contracting and business, with some other, there were some other improvements to the kid along with that. I went out and got an MBA, but somebody kicked me in the butt and said, here are the errors of your ways. I said, okay, let me jump on that.
So you went into the Army, or you were in the Navy, did aerial photography.
So I started in the Navy right out of high school. I had the option of going to be an aerial photographer or a member of the Navy band. So I played saxophone. And I had an audition with the Navy band at the Navy sub base in Groton, Connecticut. And the chief there said, yeah, you're fine, but you have to go to DC. So I had train tickets in hand and an appointment for about 3 or 4 weeks hence. And very shortly after the audition at the sub base, the recruiter called back and said, okay, I got you a seat for photo school. Make a decision. Which do you want? And at that point, I asked my father, who had given me the very excellent career advice that I was going to be doing something other than living in his house in September following high school graduation, assuming I graduated from high school, which at the point was somewhat in question, whether I would actually graduate. And he said, okay, you're not living here in September. You better figure out what you're going to do. And so I went down to see the recruiter, and I had these 2 deals going, and my dad came home from work, and I sat him down. And I said, okay, I really would rather play in the Navy band. I think that would be cool, but I don't have that locked in. He said, is the photo school slot locked in? I said, yeah, it's locked in. All I have to do is sign it and I'm in. He said, bird in the hand. So what's that mean? He said, bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. You haven't heard that saying before? And I just distinctly remember him saying bird in the hand, and then he stopped talking. And I asked for explanation. He said, you have a deal. Take the deal. Sign the paper. So I went down the next morning and after school, saw the recruiter and signed my contract. And following September, I went off to basic training and became a Navy photographer, basically goofed off for 4 years. It was more fun than anything else. Had a great time. That was a lot of fun. Of course, along the way, I kind of lost my way because at the end of the day, it worked out for the best. I ended up getting married, got divorced, got broke, got in the National Guard, got in the ROTC program, got a college degree, moved on, and that worked out pretty well.
And you eventually got to almost to lieutenant colonel.
Well, yeah, I got selected for lieutenant colonel, but my career plan was to go ahead and retire as soon as I could. And as a prior enlisted guy, I could retire as a major, so I did. The contractors were calling and they were putting big dollar signs in front of my face, and I said, okay. And that was important to me. I wanted to do that. And I could continue working in the field of national defense, even though I'd be making money at it. I said, okay, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal.
Is there any like really cool stories when you were in the Army?
Well, yeah. How much tape do you have in the camera? Because there's a couple of hours worth of stories there. I had a pretty normal Army career. I had a really, another smart guy is Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Spearman, who was the Commandant of Cadets at Arizona, sat me down right before graduation. He said, all right, Boykin, look, you tend to sort of take the easy path. Let me give you a piece of advice. You're going to have a real advantage over your contemporaries in the Army as a second lieutenant. You're going to join your first unit. You're going to be miles ahead of those guys. By the time you make first lieutenant, you're going to see the other guys start to catch up. When you become a captain, you have no advantage over them whatsoever, and that's going to be a problem for you because it's a competitive promotion cycle. It's, you have to compete with your peers for promotion. They don't keep everybody. So you're going to have to work a little harder than you're used to working, especially when it comes to staying in shape, because that's never been a big deal for me. I've always struggled staying in shape. And he said, you're going to have to work harder than everybody else. So I took that to task. And in fact, I was integrated. I was a reserve officer when I came on active duty, and I was integrated into the regular Army, which is a bit of an honor, before I made captain, which was nice. You apply for it, and if there's room in the bucket and somebody recommends you, cool. And I had a mentor, a retired general officer, and I'm wearing the big red 1 pin because I served for 5 years in the division. He served for about 12 years in the division, including he was the regimental operations officer for the 16th Infantry Regiment when they hit Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944. And he gave a great honor seminar at senior year at Arizona. You got to go to lunch with him about 8 times a year, and gave you books to read and talked you through the campaigns. From a first-person perspective, he would actually tell you, what was it like to be at Kasserine Pass? He was there. What was it like to land on Sicily? He was there. Normandy took 2 days. That was 2 full lunches, the briefing on how they hit the beach, how they got to the wire, how they got through the wire, how they got up the hills, how they took out the batteries. So that was really, really good education. And he looked out for me during my career. He got me assigned to the Big Red 1 coming out of school. I was actually assigned to escort him when he came over to visit the regiment. The Army has a system called the honorary colonel of the regiment. And this is somebody who's been in the regiment for a long time and is associated with them. They come back and talk to the guys about what it's like to be in that regiment. So he kind of gave me the history of what it was like, and he would also push me a little bit. Okay, you need to do, push this, push that. Focus on your job. Focus on doing your current job. Don't worry about getting assigned to the next job. I actually kind of deliberately tuned my interview to be a general's aide because I had just been assigned to be a fire direction officer in a firing battery. And so I literally 2 weeks before I'd moved in, the guys gotten used to me, and then they said, go interview for the general's aide job. And I went to my battalion commander. I said, I don't really want the job, but I don't want to screw this up. And he said, go do a good job in the interview, but tell them you want to stay with your troops. Okay, I'll try that. And it worked. So I didn't have to go be a general's aide, which was kind of a good deal. And I was able to get an overseas phone call, which back then was a big deal, trying to get overseas, and call General Smith, Albert H. Smith Jr., Major General, retired. And God bless him, I called him and I said, all right, here's what I want to do. And he said, don't take the aide job. He said, that's too careerist. He said, do what you're doing. You're doing fine. So that then led to a series of other jobs. The battalion moved back to the U.S. I met my wife, had a very successful tour there, got promoted, went back to Germany, this time with the 3rd Infantry Division. And that led up to Desert Storm, where I had just finished arguing with my boss for the 4th or 5th time. We didn't get along at all. And I told the major that, we need to stop worrying about all this silly stuff because we're very likely we would have to go to Saudi Arabia. And he said, they're not going to pull us out of Germany to go to Saudi Arabia, which is exactly what they did. He was none too happy with me when I turned out I was right and he was wrong because he knew he was much smarter than I am.
Everyone's much smarter than me.
Right, exactly. And so that was an interesting evolution.
Just for the ignorant people like me, too young to know what Desert Storm is, can you kind of describe the entire situation?
So it does. It is hard for me now to think about it at my age that a lot of people have been born, raised, and have jobs and careers and kids after Desert Storm. But in 1990, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait because he wanted the rest of the oil fields. And he took advantage of an interesting diplomatic situation. We had a career diplomat, a name of April Glazer, who was the ambassador to Iraq from the United States. And she delivered, I think, a pretty firm warning that the U.S. would not stand for that because we saw the forces massing. We knew what they were doing. And she told Saddam that this isn't going to stand. The U.S. will not tolerate that. But it was delivered by a woman. And what we sometimes fail to remember is we have to take other cultures' values into account. And because a woman delivered the message and not a man, the dictator in Iraq decided that wasn't important, so he invaded Kuwait. And within 48 hours, there was a coalition forming to first off defend Saudi Arabia because it looked like that's what they were going to do next, and then to eject the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And that all happened in early 1991. And it was a little bit different for us, but it was what came down to my particular participation at my tiny little part at the vanguard of the 7th U.S. Corps, which was doing what would be described in history books as the big left hook. We surrounded the Iraqi forces in Kuwait by moving 200 miles to the west and then advancing north and then northeast and then east. We basically, a pincher movement, cut them off. They were so worried about a seaborne invasion because the ships they could see the ships over the horizon or on the horizon. They saw the Marines out there. They saw the battleships. They saw the carriers. They saw the amphibious ships, and they said, "Oh, that's where they're coming." And we took them completely by surprise. And they started moving people about a day before we invaded. And my experience there culminated with something that would become known as the Battle of 7-3 Easting. Easting being a line on a map out in the middle of a faceless desert with absolutely no features whatsoever except a small hill, which would become famous for former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, was one of the captains, one of the troop commanders in the 2nd Squadron of the 2nd Army Cavalry Regiment. And I was on the radio with him. I was in the artillery battalion supporting him. And I was taking their calls for fire. And we got into what would become known as the last great tank battle. And it was pretty much right out of, the Africa Corps fights in North Africa in World War II. It was armored forces. And we continued to see for an entire afternoon and evening Iraqi armored forces trying to get back to Baghdad. But they had to go through us to do it. And now there were lots of other battles going on. I don't want to claim that this was the big battle of Desert Storm, but that was my big event in my life. And then breathing oil smoke for 3 months, which you can hear in my voice. It's had its effect. But that led to my coming back to Germany, commanding twice as a captain, 2 different units, 2 different cities. And then when we got back to the U.S., we went to Fort Leavenworth. And that was the point at which I decided, you know what, this was a good run, but instead of working on my military education, I'm going to go work on my MBA. And again, the insertion of opinions and advice from other people in my life. I had a guy who I was working with, I'm still friends with today. And, he said, "Why are you getting a master's degree in HR?" And I said, "Well, it's what I've been interested in. My bachelor's degree is in organizational design and management." And he said, "No, you should get an MBA. It'll make you more employable." So I switched courses and got an MBA. And he was right. It was that, I had no business being in HR. I was all full of spit and vinegar and I knew everything. Just ask me, I would tell you how I knew everything. And it took me a couple of years to realize that coming out of the Army, I didn't know squat about the business world.
What was the difference between the Army and the business world?
Well, first off, you have to come to and understand. In the Army, I can order you to do something. My job is to take care of my soldiers and make sure they don't get killed and then go, close with and destroy the enemy force. That's completely different than what comes out of the profit and loss statement. Completely different. When you hear football players being interviewed and they talk about going to war with their guys, but they're not going to war. They're going out in the football stadium and play a game. Yes, it's a tough game. Yes, it's sometimes can be really dangerous for their bodies, but it's not like going and getting shot at. You don't get shot at in business. So the first thing I had to learn was don't lose your temper about anything. Nobody's shooting at you. There's no reason to get upset about things. No reason to yell at people. Secondly, your employees don't have to show up to work tomorrow if they don't want to. Soldiers did. They didn't have any choice. They didn't show up for work. We sent the MPs after.
Property of the government.
Property of the government. That's right. When it says GI, USGI, it's general issue. You belong, you're a GI, you belong to the government. When you have to treat your employees a lot different than you treat soldiers. And that was a tough lesson to me. That was a tough lesson for me to learn. And then I had to realize that when you're in a commercial environment, the power structure inside that environment is not always identifiable right off the bat. In the military, we wear rank on our collars or our sleeves. So I know who holds the heat in the room when I walk into the staff room. And I walk into this, the staff meeting and I sit down and I'm the adjutant and I got the battalion commander sitting to my left or the XO. And I'm looking at all the staff saying, I know who holds the heat. It's the executive officer. He runs the staff. If the battalion commander comes in, he stands up and he lets the battalion commander have his say. You walk into a meeting in a commercial company, who really holds the heat there? You don't really know. Is it the CEO? Or does the COO hold the heat because he also happens to be the primary investor in the company? Or does the CGO hold the real heat because the ownership group hired her to grow the company, so what she says goes?
Yeah, wasn't that kind of like Soviet Russia, that it wasn't the president who held the power, but the general secretary? Because the general secretary is the one who puts everyone wherever he wants to.
I think the Soviet Union was arranged that way. It's been a long time since we talked about the Soviet Union. I don't know about Russia today.
I was just like, it just seems really similar that it's not who has the power or who has the blatant power, but who has the authority over the people.
Who holds the rank in the military is very easy. Who holds power is who holds rank. You walk into any business meeting or you're working in a company, there are certain people that have tenure I walked into a company, that very first company I worked for, the boss sat me down and he said, whatever you do, don't mess with Les. And I said, he's over there running this tiny little business. He'll never get fired. Why? Because he was the guy who went 6 months without a paycheck to help the company survive. And then the owner paid him back. But he'll never forget that loyalty. So whatever Les wants, Les gets. Be nice to Les.
Oh, his name was Les.
Yeah, not less and more, but yeah, Les was the guy who sucked it up. And his wife went out and got a job that made the company successful. And the owner remembered that. So you have to understand the power structure in the company, understand who holds the heat. Most of all, you got to be nice to everybody. You don't have to be nice to people in the military. It helps. I tried to be. I use little techniques like everybody's supposed to read the training schedule every week. You publish it for next week, what we're doing. It's the plan of the day. It's where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there. So I would put a quote at the top of the training schedule every week. And then people had to go look it up, which was kind of hard. But they had to know what the quote was, and then they had to figure out where it came from. So it became a game with the soldiers. They would run around and try to figure out where it came from. There wasn't an internet back then. I didn't get an email account till the last 6 months of my second command. And it was IBM Profs, and it was all text. And yeah, there was no internet. So you had to do some research. And if you didn't know the answer, you had to do push-ups.
What was some of your favorite quotes?
There's a quote from, I can't remember who said it. It said, Jimmy Buffett said, sometimes it's really painful playing football. But beyond that, always remember when you're running, after you ran the ball, remember how much fun it was running the ball. Remember how much fun that game was.
Yeah, the journey over the reward.
Remember how much fun you had doing that. I went to the library and I researched these and I looked, and one of the greatest quotes I think lately is, be curious, not judgmental. Walt Whitman said that, but Ted Lasso made it popular. And sure enough, a friend of mine went to that bar in England a couple of weeks ago and puts up the post on social media. And what were 3 of the responses to his post? All he posted was a picture of the bar. And 3 different people posted, be curious, not judgmental, the bar room, the dart scene. And you learn a lot about leadership, but at the same time, as you transition into the civilian organization, you have to understand that what you do is measured differently. Success in the military is measured based on getting your mission accomplished. What's your mission in a business environment? And I learned very early on, even before I joined the Army, left the Army and joined industry, that there's a difference between an inside person and an outside person. And outside people make the money, but they have the least job security. Inside people, HR, finance, accounting, facilities, they have the most job security, but make the least amount of money.
What would you define judgment as? Just like going back to the quote, because I feel like everyone has their own opinion about different words.
Being judgmental, there's 2 different things here. One is judgmental, one is judgment. To be judgmental of people is to instantly assume when somebody walks in the door and they have dark skin, okay? I'm immediately assuming they're an immigrant. That's a stupid thing to do. And you have dark skin, obviously. People have assumed that.
That's fine. I don't care. I actually am secure in the way I look. I'm happy with it.
But think about how stupid it is for somebody to assume that. They're going to immediately make some assumptions, where you're born, what you're capable of, right? And a lot of times that works in reverse. When I see somebody who is Indian American, for example, used to be somebody would look at and say, they're not as smart as everybody else. Now what's the argument? Too many Indian American kids at Thomas Jefferson High School in the
we're taking
Gifted
it
Kids
all.
program.
We're taking it all over.
That's being judgmental. When you get to judgment in business, I think if there's something that I could take back over the last 25 years I've been in business. I did not exhibit good judgment in some of the things that I did or some of the things that I said. Sometimes it was just a flat out mistake, and sometimes it was just being angry about things. There's no reason to get angry in business. So exhibit good judgment in who you take on, who you alienate, who you work with, what you say. I mean, good judgment, for example, don't ever be dishonest in a business relationship, ever. I'm involved in a contract dispute right now with another company because they were dishonest with me. And at the end of the day, we're going to end up in court over it because I don't tolerate dishonesty. The Army lives by a code with its officer corps that comes from the Corps of Cadets at West Point. Their honor code at West Point is you don't lie, cheat, steal, nor tolerate those who do. And it's that second part that becomes an issue. It's easy to walk into work and don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. That's easy. What happens when you catch somebody else doing it? Do you make a fuss about it, or do you go along to get along?
Yeah, it's one of the things that you liked, honesty over harmony.
At the end of the day, you have to be honest. Now, right now, I'm involved in a contract dispute with someone who just wants to go along to get along and wants me to pay the last couple of months of a contract when they violated the contract. They broke the tenets of the contract, and now they're lying about it. So I'm going over that person's head, and I'm going to make a case about it. It's not that much money, a couple $1,000. It's not that big a deal, but it's the principle of the thing. And by the way, I no longer do business with them, so I have a little bit more leeway in holding up my end of the agreement and saying, okay, I've done my part now. I'm not going to tolerate you being dishonest about this. If you have to continue doing business with the company, that becomes a real challenge. We have in the government contracting community a whole retinue of consultants who will help you with proposals and pricing and positioning with customer and things like that. And I've been doing that for 15 years now that I've started my own company. We had a long-standing agreement with the consultants in this town. We all call each other. We all talk to each other. So if you don't pay somebody's invoice, you make them wait for a while, or you send the invoice back and you say, well, I don't really think you earned all this. I know I agreed to pay you this number of hours, but I wasn't happy with the quality of work. I want you to discount it. That person suddenly finds himself in a position of having trouble hiring new consultants. They'll call me up and I'll say, no, I'm sorry, you have a bad history with consultants, so I'm not working for it. I actually told the company that once. And I got a call because I knew the owner of the company and we'd had run-ins before. He called me up and he said, who told you that? And I said, none of your business, but you have a bad history with consultants. Now, I want you to tell me honestly, did you ever tell a consultant, I don't want to pay this bill because I don't think you earned it? Got real quiet on the other end of the phone. I said, that's what I thought. I said, so I'm not playing that game with you. If I put in the hours, you take what you get. And I will guarantee you an honest day's effort for an honest day's pay. But if you want to try and get a discount later on, that's unethical, and I'm not going to play that game. So it's tough to balance that because sometimes you find yourself in a position you have to do business with people that you don't particularly like. And I constantly tell, because I grew up sailing on Long Island Sound, and sometimes we use the phrase, I just don't like the cut of his jib. What does that mean? It can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but at the end of the day, I just don't like the way they treat people. I don't like the way they act. And I don't have to do business with you. I can go find somebody else to do business with. I'm not sleeping on a couch making $100 a month from the National Guard and needing to take whatever job I can get. I'm not in that position anymore.
So you choose the kind of work that you focus on the results, not the time you put in to get the result.
So that's a sticky wicket. When you're doing consulting work, you really have to get paid for the hours. But it's on the consultant to make sure you're delivering a quality product. So much of what I have learned in the past 15 years that I try to apply in my consulting work is expectations management. For instance, we're currently considering an engagement with a company where it's very obvious that there's a good possibility they could just look at us halfway through the proposal and say, well, you guys go write it. And we don't know squat about writing this. They have to bring the technical expertise. They're buried in with this customer. They know everything about this system. But I could see it coming down to, well, we're too busy. We don't have time to talk to you. Just write something. No, we're not going to do that. So you have to be really careful about expectations management. I have done contracts. In fact, my very first consulting contract, I gave them, we came in and looked at the rates and they said, and I said, tell you what, I'll give you I think I gave them a 10 or 15% discount across the board on everything. I gave them a budget and I said, in return, I want a bonus if we win. And this was a $75 million contract. And I said, I want a $100,000 bonus. $100,000? I said, Gary, put $100,000 in your calculator and divide it by 75 million. And what did you get? All right, fine. So after they won and all the congratulations were done, and they even invited me to the win party and I got a nice plaque. They're very nice. And Gary calls me, he says, listen, I need to talk to you about this win bonus. I'm like, oh, here it comes. Can't believe he's going to do this to me. And he said, listen, it's going to really screw up our receivables covenant with our bank if I drop $100,000 out of that. Can I pay it to you over 4 months? I said, that's all you want? Oh, you didn't think I was trying to get out of it, did you? I said, well, he said, no, just pay it over 4 months. I said, sure, of course I can. And they're very honest guys. And I continued to do business with them for many years, despite the fact the CEO is the most obnoxious jerk on the face of the planet. Oh, it was awful. But I love the president, still talk. Just had lunch with him last week, even though the company was sold years ago. Turned out to be one of my best friends. They're great guys, always honest, always stuck by their word, lived up to everything. And they had lots of reasons sometimes not to.
There's a saying that like 90% of the problems of your problems that you think you have don't exist. And the 10% that it does isn't as bad as you think it was.
I've never heard that saying before, but that's probably pretty accurate in my book. I have certainly been down the road of overthinking things, for sure. And yeah, there's a term that we use called projection, where you know when you go downstairs, your wife's going to argue with you about something, so you project the angry response you're going to give her right off the bat. And then you get downstairs and you say something, she's like, oh, okay, let's go do that. You're like, what was I worried about?
Yeah, because I do that all the time. Do you know why that happens?
It has to do, I believe, I've been told by the professionals, it has to do with way back in the cortex of your brain. You're advancing on the plane with the rest of the cavemen, trying to circle the mastodon because you need to eat. But in the back of your mind, you know, I could get run over by this thing because it's 17 times bigger than I am. Or a pterodactyl could come down and snatch me up and eat me. So there's all these different fears. So you're thinking through all of what could go wrong. And by the way, you're an experienced hunter. So you've watched your hunting partners get trampled by mastodons and they die right there. Or they're, all you can do is just put them out of their misery. So yeah, you're thinking about it. I think it has something to do with that.
A lot of your time in the Army, was there, and then maybe also comparing that to the corporate world, was there a lot of more ownership over blame in the Army than there was in corporate?
Oh, absolutely. Government employees are not held accountable the same way that commercial employees are, and commercial employees are not held accountable the same way that soldiers are. For example, something that you probably didn't know, if you see pictures of, you see Army movies and you notice that the typical issue sidearm for an Army officer is a pistol, whereas all the soldiers are carrying rifles. And occasionally the lieutenant will carry a rifle too, because the pistol's not for shooting the enemy at a distance. The reason officers carry sidearms has less to do with shooting the enemy than it has to do with shooting deserters. People don't think about that. But I actually had a guy, and I went out and researched it. The history behind the sidearm is that if in the face of imminent danger in combat, if a soldier turns to run, you're perfectly authorized to just shoot him, which tends to be a very motivating action to the other soldiers there. Okay, face the enemy, face the lieutenant or the captain. Okay, he's a pretty good shot. When I was a headquarters company commander, I had my own pistols when we were in Germany, and that was a function of being able to buy some pistols because people were leaving and they wanted to sell them. We were drawing down forces in the early 90s. And I had a competition grade 45 caliber Springfield Armory pistol that was completely accurized, had competition sights, an adjustable trigger. And of course, all your weapons have to be kept in the arms room because of the German laws. You're not allowed to own guns over there in your house. So I had the armorer bring my pistol out with me, and that's what I shot on the range. And I would bet the staff officers $10 a shot, $10 a range. and say, okay, $10, I can outshoot you. So I would shoot a couple hundred rounds every time we went out to qualify. Staff officers haven't shot in 6 months. So they come out there, they're shooting cold. They give them a couple of warm-up rounds, and then I'd beat them. They'd pay me $10. So I would routinely put $100, $150 in the first sergeant's beer fund. It wasn't for me. It was for the soldiers. But I would routinely have a good time with that. And then I would tell the soldiers, you know why I carry this pistol, right? Well, yeah, because it's better than the ones in here. No. You know why officers carry pistols? It's because if you desert in combat, I'll shoot you. And they all go back to the barracks. Man, that Captain Boykin, he's crazy. And they'd look it up and they're like, damn, he's right. He's right. You can be shot for deserting. One of them actually went to the judge advocate's office and said, my captain says he can shoot me in combat if I desert. She looked at him and said, yep, he can. And then she called me. She said, what are you telling those guys over there? I said, why, they come see you? She said, yeah. And I told them you were right. So accountability in the military, I mean, you're accountable for everything. I ended up paying for a riding lawnmower that some German civilians stole from the maintenance shop. I mean, they went in and they put it in for maintenance. I changed command. Nobody could find it afterwards. The guy had signed for it. And like, instead of doing an investigation, they just said, yeah, you lost it. So they took it out of my paycheck without any warning. Oh, I was angry about that. But you're held accountable. The commander is held accountable for everything the unit does or fails to do. Commander of a ship, same thing. Although ship captains are normally much more senior. But if you run your ship aground or somebody gets killed while you're in command, you're done. I had a family member who was commanding a ship, and under the control of the pilot in a harbor overseas, the pilot ran it aground despite the fact that my family member was arguing with him. No, don't go there. You're getting outside. No, shut up. Because when a ship goes in and out of port, the pilot's in charge. He ran it aground. My cousin never got promoted again, and he read about it in his efficiency report, because you are responsible for everything. In a commercial firm, you're responsible. If you're a salesperson, you have a quota. If you don't make your quota, and I was a salesperson. I worked for a major electronics manufacturer, and my boss went out of his way to make sure I didn't make quota and took sales away from me so he could fire me, because he got himself in a situation he shouldn't have been in. And he said, we'll take it out on Boykin. So I ended up getting fired because I didn't make quota. You're held accountable. What government employees are going through now is they are rarely held accountable, very rarely held accountable. I had a captain who worked for me at Fort Leavenworth years ago, whose claim to fame was he actually got a government employee fired. Guy never should have been hired in the first place, but hiring is done remotely. In the civilian personnel office, maybe 2 states away. This guy comes in, he's literally illiterate. Couldn't read. He had to have someone come with him to sign forms. And then he didn't show up to work, and he was constantly drunk, and they had to run him through drug and alcohol rehabilitation. So when he started, this captain came in, and the guy was working for him, and he documented 60 days of not showing up to work. And the union, of course, came to the guy's defense, and he overrode the union's objections and put him in to be fired, and they put him on a performance improvement plan, and then they fired him. Then he sued in court. Meanwhile, the captain goes off to another assignment on that post. 18 months later, he comes back. The guy's still working there, so he starts to work again, and he got him fired before he left, and they gave him a trophy. And this guy was like a GS7. He was mowing lawns or something, and he was just flat-ass incompetent. And the captain couldn't fire him. That, unfortunately, is the standard in government. I watched a government employee deliberately disobey, and this is a GS-14, it's a very senior person, deliberately disobey his boss and go to a convention in New York City from DC, because the woman he was dating, and by the way, both of these people are married to other people, the woman he was dating was going to it. So he disobeyed the boss. He went up there. She disobeyed her boss and went up there. And then they never went to any of the events. They just spent 3 days in a hotel room doing what you do in a hotel room. Or as Joe Bob Briggs used to describe it years ago, making the sign of the 2-headed aardvark. It was a great phrase. I love that phrase. Joe Bob Briggs, look it up. Great guy. He used to do movie reviews. So this guy comes back, and the IG investigates and finds out that he's got $15,000 or $16,000 worth of camera equipment that he's using for his side gig as a wedding photographer. How did he find out about this? Because the soon-to-be ex-wife, who was divorcing him because she found out about the affair, called the IG and said, would you like to see all this stuff that he bought with State Department money? And they came and confiscated it. Guess what happened to the GS-14? Nothing. They let him retire 2 years later. They didn't do anything to him. You do that in a commercial company, they'll call the police and you'll be escorted out in handcuffs. I watched a commercial company fire a guy who had been monkeying around with the company credit card, and they referred the whole thing to the sheriff's department. And then they fired him. And they said, yeah, that's a civil complaint because he had misused the company credit card to the tune of $9,000. And they didn't screw around. Now, do people get away with things in commercial companies? Sure, they do, but you have accountability. At the end of the day, a company has a bottom line. You have a P&L statement and a balance sheet, and you can measure effectiveness. So everybody in the company gets it measured. The sales guy gets measured. The CEO of the company gets measured. Did you grow the company? Did you meet your profit margin goals? Public company, private company, doesn't matter. Everybody gets measured unless you're privately held and it's your company and you're the CEO, in which case that actually creates some issues because you can't be held accountable to rules. But everybody gets held accountable. Government employees are rarely held to account. These people from Treasury Department who just got fired because they deliberately made payments to New York City after they've been told not to do that because they thought it was the right thing to do. They said, hey, we've got a contract with them. We promised them the money. We got to give them the money. Oh, no, you didn't. Boss told you not to do it until they reviewed it. And you went ahead and did it. So now you're fired.
How did you grow your accountability from when you were 26 to like the end of your Army career?
Honestly, they beat that into you. You're accountable. You live up to the code. You're accountable for your soldiers. If one of your soldiers gets hurt, what did you do wrong? I mean, I had to go to Frankfurt Airport and go out to the gate and meet a pair of parents because their kid was in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a collapsed lung after a car accident that another soldier died in because they weren't wearing their seatbelts. I mean, I told them time and time, and we give them safety briefings before the weekend. Wear your seatbelts. Well, there were 3 guys in the back of the car who couldn't find the seatbelts coming home from the bar, icy road, flipped the car, and his kid's in the back, and he gets half thrown out of the car, and he's in bad shape. So he's in a German hospital, and he's in really bad condition, and I had to go meet the parents and give him a briefing right then. I just came from the hospital. The doctor gave me a briefing. He's going to be fine. He's sedated right now. I know you want to go see him, but they won't let you in. But we can go see him either tonight or tomorrow morning. Everything's fine. You can just see him go, thank goodness. And then find out that the parents are divorced and they wanted 2 hotel rooms, but they have no money. And I said, all right, look, I only got you 1 hotel room. Deal with it. You're adults. Suck it up. But when I got out of the Army and I went to work, I had the good fortune in my first company of having a couple of mentors who told me how they hold you accountable. At the end of the day, if you're in a growth job, you get named or you get the moniker of being a gainer or a maintainer. It's the way you get identified. Once you're in the company for a while, you get known by one of those 2 terms. And if you're a maintainer, there's a spot for you in that company. You're going to keep the customer happy. You're going to keep the program going. You're going to keep the sales flowing. You ain't going to grow it. If they take cuts, you weren't prepared for that, and you take the cuts along with the government. Government says, well, I got to move things over here. You didn't see that coming. Then there's gainers. They're not only going to keep it going, but they're finding new ways to grow things. And one of the big sources of government growth is contractors. Contractors are actively seeking ways to help their government customer get more budget. Hey, here's a good idea. Could do this. By the way, put it on my task order. So I hate to, let the canary out of the cage here. But a good portion of what goes on in the services business, which is not the biggest issue in government spending right now. Grants are the biggest issue, and then entitlements. But when it comes to contractor spending, services are primarily driven by, in my opinion, the government contractor getting in there because your guidance from the company, as soon as you get in there and get a contract for 10 people, how soon can you make it 12 and 14 people? Got to go grow it. How do you do that? You give a white paper to your customer. Here's a task you should be doing. Here's something else you got to be doing. Here's what's not in the contract, and you know the guy to do that. And you grow it exponentially. You grow it incrementally. I'm sorry, not exponentially. And I've done that. I've done the incremental growth as a program manager on site. Been down to the headquarters, talking to the guy. Look, you need this, this, and this. Okay, well, what that's going to cost me? 2 more people. I'll write you up a little bid. Okay, fine. Boom, go to the contracting officer. Now, my 5-person task became 7, became 11. I think I jumped it up to 25 before we won the big 55-person contract. That's what you're there for. But that's taxpayer money you're spending. It's not the contractor's job to keep an eye on it. It's government managers to keep job. Government managers are incentivized to grow their program. If you're GS14 and you want to be a GS15, and who wouldn't? Excuse me. If you're a GS14 and you want to be a GS15, you can either go find a GS15 position, or you can grow your budget so that you meet the requirements that your position should be upgraded to a GS15. And that's how most of that growth occurs. Some GS13 goes in and says, hey, I want to be a 14. I'm managing X number of people. I need Y number of people to be a GS14. Grow my thing, go back into the Office of Personnel Management and say, I'm now managing Y number of people, upgrade my position.
Is there any part in talking to all the people, going through all the budgets, going through the sucking up to people in any contract that you had? Was there anything when you just had to be, where you had to be silent rather than correct someone over something?
The only thing I can think of in my career was I did work for a company that was owned by a guy who was born in Korea, grew up in Korea, moved to Taiwan, and then emigrated to the United States. And one of the things you had to get used to when you work in that company is that the Oriental culture comes into play. So you would never, ever correct him in a meeting. That was absolutely verboten. Good news was my boss at the time had lived in Korea for many years, was married to a Korean, had been a Korean foreign area officer, and spoke Korean. So he gave me the full briefing. When you come over here, you got to do this, and I'd worked for him for a while before. Then he brought me over to his new company. He said, you have a habit of doing this. You have a habit of speaking out in meetings. Curb your enthusiasm. Long before Larry David came up with a TV show called that. He said, curb your enthusiasm. Don't ever correct the CEO in a meeting. So I learned, and in fact, this CEO just called me last week for some advice. He's a good guy, but you had to learn how to deal with him. He could be very stubborn. Duh, he's Korean. It's built in. How do you think you survive in that environment in Korea? It's a inhospitable country to live in. Yeah, but that's the nature of the culture. They've survived on that peninsula for that many years by being stubborn. And what I developed a habit of was I would take notes on my notepad, and then that night, because he always worked late, I would wait till that evening. I would knock on his door. I wouldn't bow at the door like the other Korean H-1B IT guys would, which drove the admin crazy. So I can't believe they. I said, Joanne, it's their culture. Just accept it. It's cool. But I would knock on the door. He'd call me in, sit down, talk to him, and say, listen, I didn't want to say anything in the meeting, but you might want to reconsider this. And after the third time I did that, he said, I really appreciate these little chats we have. You feel free to come here anytime. Now, I would always go back and tell my boss that I was going to see him. And I remember that third time he says, Dennis, I really appreciate these little chats. Now, he liked people going around the chain of command. He really liked people to go around and rat out their boss. He thought that was cool. And I took him to task for it on occasion. I said, you got to hold the boss accountable. You can't be talking to the employees directly, but checking in, I get what you're doing. But yeah, I learned to never call him out front. Now, did I ever deliberately not say something? Not so much that I didn't say something, but I did encourage somebody to do something that I knew was going to get him in trouble. Back in the day before, as the internet was becoming popular, but before LinkedIn, there were email trains going around where you could, talk to your buddies and say, what do you know about this guy? So director of HR calls me in and he says, okay, your boss has left, you're the acting. We've interviewed people. We don't think you're experienced enough to take the job. So we've got another guy. We haven't made him an offer yet. So we'd like you to meet with him first because you're definitely the guy who makes things click in that business unit. We're about a $30-something million business unit, and I was running one of the programs and I was the deputy. I was a VP at the time, and the senior VP had left. So they said, look, we don't want to promote you to senior VP, but before we make this guy an offer, go to dinner with him. So I did, and I got his name. And so I vetted him with a couple of friends, and I got back some very negative reports that he was leaving the company because he had trouble getting along with people and he would throw people under the bus. I'm like, okay, I've got people that I respect who say, yeah, he's not somebody you want to work for. And I would be reporting directly to him. So he comes in, actually seemed like a very nice guy. And we had a great discussion, but he was really doing his best to sell me. And it became very clear that he had been told to sell me because They knew that if I didn't like this, I was going to leave, and they would lose 2 customer relationships. That would be a big deal. So I said, okay. As I sized him up, I started to get a little bit annoyed with him. I'm like, he's really sucking up to me, and I don't like people sucking up to me. And then he said, so listen, I feel like we're really going to get along great. And he was just making all these assumptions. And he said, I want to ask your advice. I said, sure, anything I can do to help you out. He said, well, listen, I got my offer letter yesterday. And I'm like, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, you what? So now I've got a VP of HR who lied to me. He didn't have to lie to me. He didn't have to do that, but he did. And I know the VP of HR was the one who sent it, because I asked him, I said, you got an offer letter already? Who'd you? He said, Norm sent me the offer letter. I said, oh, okay. He said, I'm not too happy with the terms on there. What do you think the CEO's position is going to be if I go back and try to negotiate it? And I thought about, you ever have one of those moments in life where your whole life flashes before your eyes? And I thought, okay, now the context, I'm already negotiating with the company, with my old boss. He wants to bring me to his new company. So I'm expecting that offer letter. I mean, we've already worked out the terms. So I know I have a place to go. So I can, really step on it here if I want to. I said, okay. I said, well, he's a businessman. I mean, I guess you could. And I knew damn well that was just going to send the CEO through the roof, because he was a very arrogant individual. And he very much looked on his employees as his serfs. He's in the castle, but he had his serfs out there, tending the crops outside. Very much the royalty mentality. Very much, he grew up in the caste system. He understood how that worked. And I had somebody very early on, a retired colonel who worked there, was kind of like the go-to guy to fix things in the company. Great guy. Told me, look, you got to understand when you work here, he's the Lord of the manor. You get your 10 acres to grow. If you do good, they'll give you more acreage. If the Visigoths come to attack, they'll let you in. And on occasion, they'll invite you upstairs for dinner. But don't think you get to sleep upstairs, okay? So I knew this was going to set the guy off. So I said, sure, yeah, go ahead and go back there. Well, I got my butt chewed. And I just looked at the VP of HR, because by this point, of course, the next day I've called John and I said, you got that offer letter ready? And he said, as a matter of fact, yeah, can I come by and get it? He said, well, you getting fired? I said, I told him what he did. And when he stopped laughing, he said, oh yeah, you've burned your bridges there, buddy. Come on over. So I came over, I signed the offer letter, I had to start. And then I went over to the company and, Norm was, and he just went off on me. Well, because he had to go find another candidate. And I said, okay, the guy asked me a question. I gave him my honest opinion, but I was truthful with him, Norm. I didn't lie to him, because he told me he already had the offer letter. See, didn't you tell me you hadn't made the offer yet? So who's being dishonest here, Norm? And that's when he threw me out of his office. I said, okay, it's a good thing I had to. So one of the lessons I learned from that is always have options. And that was something I learned. You and I talked about this before. When I was a captain in the Army, about to make major, and I realized this probably wasn't what I wanted to do for 30 years. I was going to hit my 20-year mark and be eligible to retire. I started working on my master's degree because I wanted to be prepared for a career in business. And I went out. I've always kept that philosophy since I got my career back on track. Always have options. Go get some experience. Go bid some programs that you might not be really good at. When somebody said, look, here's a really tough nut to crack. How about we put you in charge of these programs out in Detroit and New Mexico and Arizona, and they were all barely profitable. And I was counseled by another guy in the company. He said, don't take it. They're setting you up to fail. And I said, you know what? This is a good chance for me to learn and grow. And I turned them into profit, and we won a couple more positions, and I grew the business line, and they turned it over to somebody else and gave me the next desk. So always keep your options open. Yeah, have I ever kept my mouth shut in the back of the room and watched people tank themselves? No, I didn't keep my mouth shut. I opened it. I did. And I do have a habit of opening my mouth when I don't need to. But the one time I did do it, which is kind of a funny story, we were in a war game planning session in the late 90s. We're planning out we were at Carlaw Barracks in the late 90s, planning out a wargaming operation for the Chief of Staff of the Army. So you run a war game where you get a bunch of really smart people in a room and you work through what would happen. I mean, you've seen stories in New York Times about how they've war gamed an invasion of Taiwan, for example. So the Rand Corporation will do it, Answer will do it, the Army, Air Force, they'll do it. And you bring a bunch of people and say, okay, here's a big map and here's the road to war. Here's what happened. Here's the situation. What would you do? In the particular case, we were fighting with terrorists in the Middle East. And how would you affect this? And so the powers that be, all the colonels and lieutenant colonels, were working through all these options. And I could see the guy over in the corner of the room, the civilian, whose name escapes me right now, but it's actually, I just remembered it, but it's not important who he was. He would go on to a very important position in the next administration as a member of the National Security Council. And he had a long history of working with three-letter agencies, and he was an Army veteran. And he had a long history. He actually was very closely associated with the boat lift in 1975 out of Vietnam, where they lifted a bunch of people out of there, took them to the Philippines. And I could see him getting frustrated over there. And I'm listening to all these guys talk about developing a target list of what the terrorists would attack in the United States. And they started coming down to these really esoteric things that made no sense. And I wasn't on too shaky ground because I could see him over there just kind of shaking his head. And he's got this big bull neck and he's a weightlifter and he's looking angry. And I raised my hand and I said, Colonel, can I jump in here for a second? And he said, yeah, Boykin, what do you got? I said, sir, it just occurred to me that we're trying to work out a scenario where Middle Eastern terrorists would attack targets in the U.S. And by the way, this is prior to 2001. This is like 1996 or 97. So this is post First World Trade Center bombing. Okay, but before 9/11. So pre 9/11, they're coming up with all these ideas. And I said, with all due respect, Colonel, you guys are coming up with some really great ideas. And this is exactly what graduates of the War College would think up. Got real quiet. And you could see guys going, oh, Major Boykin, what are you doing? I said, but sir, none of the people who are thinking up this targeting are graduates of the War College, and none of you attended a madras in the country that they grew up in. So I think maybe we'd be better off going and finding some people who think like them or grew up with them. And he said, thank you very much for your input, Major. Now sit down and be quiet. And God bless this guy. Now, wait a minute, Colonel. I think maybe the Major has a point there. Now, the whole room goes quiet. And the Colonel looks at him. He's like, he was a jerk. He was a real jerk. He used to drive me crazy because he wouldn't listen to me about there's a good idea cutoff date for software, and he wanted to make changes to the software up till the week prior to the game. I needed like 3 months to get everything run and tested because we were doing waterfall, not agile. This is 1996 and 97. So I said, oh, thank God. So, Major, why don't you expound on that theory there and explain to the Colonel what you're trying to say? And I'm like, oh, crap. Now I got myself into it. Thank God I didn't work for that Colonel. He was just my customer. And I said, well, you're coming up with targets like the power grid. Yes, tactically, that's exactly what you would do. If you're a War College graduate and you want to go after the U.S., go after the power grid. But look at what terrorists have done so far. They want something splashy. They want big news. They know it's a suicide mission. They went after the World Trade Center a couple of years ago. They'll probably go after that again. I actually said that in the meeting. It's recorded somewhere. I said, they'll probably go after the World Trade Center again. And he said, yeah, I think that's a good point. So yeah, sometimes you got to speak up in the room. I only ever kept my mouth shut when I knew that it would not do well for me. And then I would go talk to somebody afterwards. And that was a skill that, frankly, I didn't learn it. I was taught it. Somebody said, this is what you need to do.
So at the points when there's nothing to lose, but there's also nothing to gain.
Yeah, I very rarely find myself in that position. Usually there's all sorts of things to lose or something to gain.
But there's nothing neutral ground.
Right.
There's a couple things I wanted to go to.
I know one of the things you wanted to talk about was the best job interview I ever had.
Oh, yeah. We'll do that. And then there's another thing I wanted to go to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I found myself, I told you earlier, I had 2 commands in the Army. My first command was going to end early through no fault of my own. The Army was standing my unit down and I would end up 1 month short. Well, that was going to show up on my officer record brief as a deficiency. So I had to go find another command. And my old battalion commander from Desert Storm called me up one day out of the blue and he said, I heard you're standing down. I said, once again, sir, you're dialed in. I don't know who your friends are, but you're good. I said, what's it? And he would go on to retire as a 2-star general running the personnel command. I mean, he was always into taking care of people's careers. Good guy. So Colonel Adair said, okay, here's the deal. I think I can get you a job over here at this unit or whatever. And I also called this guy and I said, thank you, sir. That'd be great. So I go interview with the lieutenant colonel. His battalion is moving to Fort Sill. And he said, yeah, you can get headquarters battery. And I'm like, okay, that's great. He said, of course, when you get to Fort Sill, there are no barracks. There's no motor pool. We're just going to double park in this other unit's motor pool. And we're going to be, basically, you'll have like 30 soldiers in your 150 soldier unit. And then we got to reconstitute everything. And I'm like, oh, crap. I said, all right, sir, let me go tell my wife because she didn't want to go Fort Sill. I went back, talked to my battalion commander. And he said, glad you came in. Just got off the phone with the executive officer of the division artillery down in Baumholder. I went to the command course with him and I talked to him and he said he'd grant you an interview, but you have to come down tomorrow and don't hold your breath because he's got 4 captains ahead of you in line. But you would be the headquarters battery commander of the division artillery. That's a brigade-sized element. It's 350 soldiers. It's a real feather in my cap. And I said, oh, I'm there. Went home, grabbed my best starched uniform, left at 4 a.m., drove down, the 3.5 hours down to Baumholder, went in for the interview. You have to picture this in a German barracks. He's got this tiny little 2-man room as his office because he's the lieutenant colonel executive officer. He was actually a major promotable at the time. This is a guy who would go on to retire as 3 stars. And so I walked in, saluted, sat down with him, and he started the interview off with, okay, you didn't get your hopes up on this. I said, no, sir, Colonel told me all about it, and I understand that, but I'm here to make the case that, he said, yeah, okay, it's a fairly good record, but, and the phone rang. And he picks up the phone. He's got to talk to this person for a second about something. And I looked up at the wall, and there were 2 government issue 8x10 picture frames, stamped metal, Industries for the Blind, right from the supply room. One was a picture of the ATACMS missile in the 270 launcher, halfway out the pod. And it's a famous picture. Every artillery guy knows this picture. There's this big ATACMS ballistic missile halfway out the pod. It's a perfect picture. And I said, wow, that's a great picture. And it's signed. Now, back in the day, there was a tradition in the Army that you get an autographed picture if you worked for a general officer, and then you'd put those up in your office to prove that you had more general friends than the other guy did. But I hadn't seen those in years. They kind of went away. But here he's got a signature. And I knew that my previous DIVARTY commander at Fort Riley years ago had been the program manager for ATACMS. And I knew his signature, and it looked a lot like it from a distance. I couldn't tell. The other picture frame was occupied by a leave form with all sorts of red and blue stamps all over it and 2 tickets to the last Super Bowl. So when he gets off the phone, he says, where was I? Oh, yeah, I was telling you why you weren't going to get this job. And I said, sir, I got that, but I got to ask you a question. What's up with the Super Bowl tickets? Oh, here we go. The room lights up. He gets all excited because he was a football player at West Point. He was a linebacker. And he tells me all about Joe Theismann, Super Bowl game winner. He's all excited about this. And then I don't know if there's another phone call that interrupted us or if I just jumped in at the end. And he looked at me and I said, so I'm kind of wondering, and I don't mean to delay you, but what's up with that other picture? And you could tell the change. It was as if somebody reached around behind my back and turned the thermostat down 30 degrees. And I watched him tense up and he said, why do you ask? I said, well, sir, everybody knows that picture, but I know Colonel Jim Roberts was the program manager for that program a couple of years ago. And that looks like his signature. Now he's gritting his teeth and he's talking to me through gritted teeth. And he says, as a matter of fact, it is. Why do you ask? Now he's already told me 3 times I'm not getting this job. I've driven 3.5 or 4 hours from Frankfurt down to Baumholder, the other side of Frankfurt down to Baumholder. I got to go face German traffic again to tell my wife we're going to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and she does not want to go to Fort Sill. So I thought about Tom Cruise and risky business. And I said, sometimes you just got to say, what the fuck? Sometimes you just got to say it. So he looks at me and he asks me my opinion. And I said, well, sir, I'm a captain of the United States Army. I don't speak ill of senior officers, but if you're asking me for my honest opinion, he said, I am. Now, at this point, his ears are turning red. And I'm like, okay, this is like shooting ducks in a barrel. I said, frankly, sir, I'm surprised you have his autograph on the wall because we all thought he was an effing weasel. And I saw my entire career flash before my eyes. I said, maybe the colonel let me go to Fort Sill, 5th to 17th Field Artillery, and maybe I can still get that job. And his big meaty paws came down, slammed down the desk. He said, stay right there. I mean, he made this decision in like 3 seconds. Goes around desk, walks out. So 2 hours later, it seemed like 2 hours. It was probably 15 seconds. But I'm sitting there. My heart is racing. The adrenaline's pumping. I'm like, oh, what the hell have I done? And I hear this, Boykin, get over here. And I grab my hat, folder, and I go over there. And he's standing in a division artillery commander's doorway. He says, come here. And he walks in and he introduces me to the colonel, full colonel, 06. He introduces me to this guy and says, here's your next headquarters battery commander. And while the colonel is shaking my hand, he looks at the lieutenant colonel and says, are you sure you want to do this? You're going to gore a couple of oxes here. I'm going to have to soothe a couple of battalion commanders. And he said, oh, trust me, sir. This guy has a pair bigger than cannonballs. This is the guy we need to go fix that mess down there. And it turned out what had happened was, over the course of the drawdown, and this is 1992, late 92, early 93, during the course of the drawdown in the early 90s, the headquarters battery had been collecting equipment from other units because the staff officers just went out and got it. And they had a building full of equipment they couldn't get into until they started pulling stuff out of the hallway. It was a fire hazard. And they had no accountability for any of their stuff. And it was a mess. He said, okay. So Dennis, go over there, have a seat on my sofa. He had a little seating area. It was a typical colonel's office, big, huge. It was the old day room from the barracks. Go sit over there. And as I'm walking over there, he looks at me, he says, you really sure you want to do this? You know who is going to get really upset with me. And he said, I'll handle it, sir. I'll call him. He said, no. You better let me call him. He's going to be pissed because he wants to take care of his favorite captain. I said, I'll take care of it. And then he comes down and sits down and we interviewed for a while and he says, all right, well, why don't you drive home and tell your wife you're moving down here and looking forward to working with you. And he said, when next time we go out to the field and we get a quiet minute, I want you to tell me how the hell you convinced him to hire you. I said, all right, sir, it's a pretty good story. And that's how I got hired for the job and basically saved my career.
But why did he have the picture on the wall?
Because he couldn't stand that guy. And at the end of, and I left out the part, at the end of that, before he got up and left, when I asked him why I was up there, he says, that young man is to remind me how it's not to be done. And that colonel, he had issues with that colonel, and I have no idea what happened there. I thought he was a perfectly okay Divardi commander, except I didn't really like him very much. He really was a weasel. And that's my opinion. I'm allowed to state it. But during that discussion, I forgot to tell you, he did say that's to remind me how not to do it.
There's nothing to lose.
So I had everything to gain and nothing to lose. It wasn't neutral. The only thing I could do was gain something or lose something. He could have sent me to the stockade for insulting a colonel, but he wasn't going to do that. I told him what I thought. He realized I had a brass pair and I was the guy to go fix things, which I spent the next year fixing.
So going back to the guy who was trying to give you like a little sales pitch and not really try to figure out what you wanted.
Oh, this was a guy who was going to be my boss.
So I was wondering, since you have both military, government, corporate, I always get annoyed by people who have like the corporate talk, that they have this like this neutral, but they don't really care kind of attitude, but it's also they have to say it because it's the right thing to say. Why do people do that?
You don't want to tell people a riff is coming. There's also legal reasons to do it. It's really a bad idea to sit in an interview, for example, and have somebody look at somebody that's interviewing with you for a job in your company and say, yeah, I don't think you're going to cut it. That's just not a good practice. Now, it's always okay to say there are a lot of applicants for this position. I can't tell you how well you did or how well you didn't do because I have to run this through my boss. At the end of the day, you're deflecting. You know darn well after you're talking to that person if they're going to be under consideration or not. If there's a clear hole in the resume, I've always looked at people and said, look, this position absolutely requires this. And I can tell you from personal experience, I got hired into a job as a salesperson at a major electronics manufacturer, and I was the only person in the room that didn't have a college degree, except for one other guy. And the one other guy was actually pretty successful, but that was the exception, not the rule. So I know what it's like when you get hired with a big hole in your resume, and that didn't turn out well for me. This isn't going to turn out well for you because you have this big hole in your resume. Now, it's easy if they're not technically qualified. You shouldn't have gotten to the interview in the first place. If he doesn't have a PMP and it requires project management professional certification to hold the job, because that's what the government requires and it's a billable position, then he shouldn't have gotten there in the first place. When you get to the interview, you're in a qualitative state. So it's always better from the company's perspective to say, thanks much for coming in. You've got a great attitude. I can't guarantee you're going to get this job or you're not going to get this job. We have to compare it against everybody else. We have a team of reviewers. And typically when you interview for a job, you're going to get 3 interviews. So you can legitimately and honestly look at the person and say, I have to talk to the other folks. You certainly did fine with me. And you can dodge that accountability.
Because a lot of lawsuits, or I don't know if a lot of them, but a lot of the ones that I hear about are usually people who are disgruntled, or they got their feelings hurt, or they just they're just, for lack of a better word, a snowflake. They'll just.
I love that term. So whether or not they're a snowflake is immaterial. One of the things you have to do in order to deal with somebody who's threatening a lawsuit is you have to look at what's the lawsuit worth to me. Now, for example, I'm in this contractual dispute with another company. It's a couple $1,000. For me, I'm going to go down to the county courthouse, fill out a small claims lawsuit, and file suit. The company's going to have to turn it over to their lawyer and pay their lawyer to deal with it, and their lawyer's going to have to drive out to the hearing. So they're going to want to settle that as quickly as possible. They're going to say, okay, fine, we'll 2 months worth of rent on a contract and a security deposit, fine, go away. What you want to do is avoid the lawsuit in the first place. So when someone's disgruntled and they file a lawsuit, you have 2 issues with that. One, it's going to cost you money to defend yourself. 2, that person now can go out and publicize that lawsuit. That's public, it's public record. Now, lawsuits are not public record in that they're immediately posted to social media. You have to basically, in most states in the union, you have to have a LexisNexis account. But you can download it and then you could post up to your LinkedIn page. I'm suing this company because they treated me unfairly. Then you go out on Glassdoor and give them a bad rating. Say, I'm suing this. And Glassdoor will not moderate that, especially if you actually provide a copy and use the little link button on the Glassdoor rating thing and say, yeah, here's a copy of my lawsuit because they treated me badly. What are they going to do? Well, most companies monitor their Glassdoor rating. They're going to go in and they're going to respond to that. But if you posted a copy of the lawsuit, what can they say? Yeah, we think the lawsuit is unfounded. Gee, if I had $1 for everybody who'd ever said that in the world, I'd be rich. So I understand why they do it. I don't like it any more than you do.
It seems like a theme that keeps coming back, but I don't know if this is the best, if it works with what we're talking about. Authenticity over fantasy. Being an authentic person rather than trying to create a world that doesn't exist. So I think a lot of the people, not the people I meet, but a lot of people my age who don't really have that enthusiasm to try something new, to do something new, to take that risk, are usually because they live in a world that it's like, social media, you have all these idealized versions of people, the ones who have Porsches at 25 and they're living the life on yachts and going to Monaco and throw their time in nightclubs and everything. And it's like, so some people want, like, I don't want that. It seems like a waste of time. But some people want that because they want to live in like a fantasy world. So what would be your opinion on being yourself rather than trying to be something that you're not?
When I grew up, we were in the midst of the Cold War, and we practiced hiding under our desks in school like that was going to protect us from an atomic blast. I grew up very close to a shipyard in Connecticut where they built nuclear submarines and also had a submarine base, so we were pretty certain that we were one of the targets. So when all that kind of ends, it's a little bit different mentality. My mentality growing up in the 50s and 60s is very different than somebody who grew up in the 80s or 90s. Even more different than somebody who's grown up in the last 20 years. If you've grown up in the age of social media, I think most people are smart enough to understand that what you're looking at in your Instagram feed or your TikTok reels is not real. People are only putting their best version forward. I try to be authentic in the things that I post in social media, and I try to be authentic with people when I talk to them. That I've learned, having lived in 4 countries, held a job in 3 of them. I've been to 20 plus countries. By the end of this year, it'll be closer to 30 countries. We're doing some traveling this year. That there's a whole big world out there. And if your world is all wrapped around your phone and what your friends are saying, you're not paying attention to what's really out there. The real world is a beautiful place, but it also can be very scary. But the real world has to be seen with your own eyes. You can't see it through social media. Because what you see is not what you get. When you get out to other countries, you've seen the bad and you've seen the really good. The reality is it's mostly pretty good. Most countries really are pretty nice. There are a few countries in the Middle East I don't ever want to go back to again, but it isn't that the people aren't nice. They're struggling to make a living like anybody else. They're struggling to survive. It's just an area of the country that's not very pretty. I've also been to Switzerland. I've lived in Germany. I've lived in Kuwait. Killed people there too. Not someplace I want to go back to.
How much more voice do you have?
Yeah, I do one more question. I'm fine.
Well, then I'll ask you the question I always ask everyone at the very end. Well, two questions, but I guess the second one wouldn't really apply to you anymore. The first one is...
Because if you're looking at for my 10 and 20 year goals, that's a running, because I actually did for a long time, you're talking about goal setting, for a long time back in the day before we carried these little devices in our hands, I had a 3-ring binder with me every day, and ever since I left the Army. And while I was in the Army, I had a binder with me, smaller, but the last tab was my goals, and I had 1, 5, and 10-year goals. And I had a goal of getting my master's degree, and I had a goal of becoming a vice president, and a goal of being a senior VP, and a goal of owning my own company. I've reached all those goals. Yeah, when you turn 70 in 2 weeks, you don't have any more 10 and 20-year goals. My goals are I'm going to meet with my financial advisor and find out how much I can take out of my accounts every month to last me until I'm 85 or 90, because I plan on living a long time, and can I afford another airplane?
So I'll ask you the first question.
Sure.
What would you say to yourself at 26?
Oh, that's a good one. That's an excellent question. I'm trying to remember where I was at 26. Well, I won't tell you what was going on with me personally, because it involves a lot of Friday nights at happy hours at a singles club and what went on.
Yeah. This is I try to keep this PG-13.
We're at PG-13, yeah. So what would I tell myself? I think at 26 was about the time that I had gotten kicked in the butt and told, get your acting gear. And there were some real down times. I mean, I was dating a woman. I realized she was bad for me, and I had broken up with her, and I was feeling like I was just sitting in the dark holding my head crying. And I didn't have a job, and I didn't have a lot of income, and my roommate was getting tired of paying all the rent, and he was threatening to kick me out, and my car wasn't running. So it was getting pretty ugly. And I think what I would have told myself at 26, since I had just gotten divorced, I was in the process of getting divorced, would probably have been stick up for yourself more in the divorce. I mean, I let her take the silver that my family bought us that had my initial on it. I think that was stupid. Stick up for yourself. Not just that, but the fact that, she had been unfaithful with the guy who I had the office next to, or had the desk next to in the sales pit. So I would stick up for yourself more and get off your butt and do something. Don't sit back and just let the world come to you. I mean, by the time I was 26, I had joined the Navy. I had seen the world, known as Italy, Spain, and France in the Mediterranean, and then back to Virginia, and then I got out. And then over to California, and I got out. So I'd been to Mexico once. I hadn't really seen the world. And I was just kind of existing, where I had so much more potential. And it frustrated people. My second roommate's girlfriend was sitting there one day. In fact, I still talk to her daughter to this day. Her daughter called me up one day, years later, and asked me for advice about going to the Department of Defense school system overseas. So she did. She ended up getting assigned to a school very close to where I was stationed, and met one of my fellow lieutenants in the battalion and married him. So now she's retired here in Virginia with him, and they have kids. And her mom really took me to task one Friday night, or one Saturday morning, because she'd stayed over with my roommate. And yet another person walked out of the house on a Saturday morning, and she said, "What are you doing?" Of course, my roommate had yelled at me about this, and she said, "What are you doing? Why aren't you back in college? And she just went off on me. And it wasn't very shortly thereafter that the sergeant first class went off on me and said, "Get your butt in gear." So if I could go back and talk to myself at that age, it would be try to be a better husband. I'm not sure I was a great husband. I certainly made some mistakes. Never should have gotten married at 21. It was way too early. And then just get back to work. I mean, when you get thrown off the horse, stand up, dust yourself off, get back on the horse. Don't be afraid of horses.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm toast, man.
Yeah. No, that's the problem is when interesting people start talking, I just shut down. I just start listening.